Good evening. I'm Max Angerholzer in behalf of the George and Barbara Bush Foundation. Greetings from the Bush Center on the campus of Texas A&M University in College Station. Welcome to this special virtual event with my friend Fred Ryan, a conversation about his book, Wine and the White House. The George and Barbara Bush Foundation, as many of you know, our mission is focused on protecting, amplifying, and sharing the legacies of George and Barbara Bush with more people in the United States and around the world. We also do this by supporting the Bush School of Government at Texas A&M University, and of course the Presidential Library and Museum, also here at the Bush Center in College Station. We thought that tonight would be a nice, fun event. It might be a little bit of a departure and a little greater levity than some of the events we've had recently, like our recent conversation with Ambassador Ryan Crocker on Afghanistan, but I think we could all use some good news in these trying times that we're living in. And I'm excited that Fred can bring some fun to this event here this evening. This also is a kickstart of our wine season here at the Bush Foundation, which will culminate on November 18th with our annual Vintner Dinner in Houston. I hope many of you can join us for that in person. We're really excited that it'll be headlined this year by presidential historian John Meacham, and of course our friend and board member Gene Becker, who was President Bush's chief of staff for all of his years outside of the White House. So that'll be a lot of fun, and if you'd like information on how to register, please go to our website. I'd also think it's very appropriate to note that tonight, more than any night, is a great night to drink wine here in College Station, because I think all my new Aggie friends are still celebrating the big victory over Alabama at Kyle Field on Saturday night. And I think Northgate and the Dixie Chicken are still packed from that. So the party has continued from the wee hours of Sunday morning. I'd like to thank our team at the George and Barbara Bush Foundation for making tonight possible, especially Sarah Farrell and Audrey Fidel, and the hard work that went into all of this. I'd like to thank our partners at the library, led by Warren Finch. He's an Auburn fan, but he wasn't here this weekend, but I know he's looking forward to the Auburn Tigers coming to College Station in a few weeks. And then also, of course, our friends here at Tex Ags. They make this possible. Andrew and Dalton and the rest of the team are incredible. So I want to thank them for this support. I'd also like to thank our friends and colleagues at the White House Historical Association. They published Fred's book, which we'll learn more about tonight. And their president, Stuart McLaurin, and their board member, Anita McBride, were actually with us last week. We were happy to host them here at the Bush Center. So wanted to get through those thank yous. And now on to the program. Really excited to have Fred with us. He has an extraordinarily unique and interesting resume. I will not go into all the aspects of this, but Fred was a senior official in the Reagan White House, and then joined President Reagan when he went back to California after his second term was up, and served as his chief of staff in his post-presidency. Fred has been chairman of the Reagan Foundation for many years, and also the White House Historical Association. He's currently the publisher and CEO of the Washington Post. And one thing that I'd like Fred to talk about later in our conversation is in the fall of 1980, he had the opportunity to travel with Ambassador Bush, who of course was the vice presidential nominee then. A final plug I wanted to put in, you can find Fred's book on the website of the White House Historical Association. So if you haven't bought it already, please do so after this event. And you can also find it on the Amazon website, and I understand Fred knows people at Amazon. So Fred, without further ado, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Max. Great to be with you, and great to be with the supporters of the Bush Foundation.
Okay, Fred, so I think all of us have thought, if we could write any book, what would it be? And so how did you come about writing this book? What was sort of the genesis of that, and how did you get so excited about wine? Because I've known you long enough to know that this is one of your passions.
Well, you and I have shared, I won't say a few glasses of wine, I'd say many glasses of wine, Max. Well, on the question of the book, how often do you get a chance to write a book about something you're passionate about, and how often can you write about the intersection of two areas that you're passionate about? One, wine, and the second is presidential history, areas I've always been interested in. And as you mentioned, the White House Historical Association publishes books about different aspects of the White House. And over the years, there have been books on virtually every president, many books on most presidents. There have been books published about the art in the White House and food in the White House and the china in the White House, the architecture in the White House, music in the White House, but there had never been a book about wine in the White House. And I raised it with the White House Historical Association. So why don't we do a book on that? And they said, well, you think it's such a good idea, why don't you do it? So I did, and it started off intending to be a very brief book on what president's strength. But what I found was, since there's never been a book in this area, I kept getting more and more information. I was finding original sources. I was finding things that I never knew about the presidents and about who advised them and the wines they served and when they served wine when they weren't supposed to, and how the wine service evolved from George Washington's day to present day, how work goes into state dinners. I learned about the glassware that's used and how much time the White House put into that. And then just a lot on the menus and the wines that were served. So this book was meant to be a fairly modest project, and now I know if you've picked it up, Max, it weighs almost 6 pounds, and it's fairly it's the definitive work for the moment until somebody else does another book. But the last thing I would just say is I found that it appealed to different audiences. People who are interested in history, so there was a lot in there, but then people who were just interested in wine. So the final chapter in the book is a list of every wine that's been served in the White House during the modern presidency, by the occasion, by the vintage, the particular wine. And I've had a lot of people email me saying that they've had fun recreating White House dinners with by looking at those wines and looking at the menus and preparing a similar meal.
Well, and thanks to the back of your book, I was able to discover that Sanford Chardonnay from Santa Barbara County was one of the first wines that President Bush introduced to the White House. And so I have some of that here with me tonight. It is not the 1980s vintage, but it's still very good. So I think one thing, maybe we can just jump right in. You touch on this in your book, and of course, you knew President Bush well, but he had this incredible experience in diplomacy before he came to the White House. When you think about, he was CIA director, he was ambassador to the UN, he of course served in the US Congress before that. He had all of this diplomatic experience, this political experience, and he brought that with him to the White House. So can you talk a little bit about how that diplomatic experience may have gone into how he took advantage of state dinners and how he took advantage of wine at some of these events?
Sure. Well, he was uniquely prepared to be president with the roles that you mentioned, and of course, 8 years in the vice president's residence, entertaining heads of state and important visitors. So he and Barbara Bush became very skilled at state dinners and major diplomatic events. And as you know, a state dinner, there's enormous amount of planning that goes into that, and sometimes weeks and many months. And depending on the visitor, if it's a royal visit, if it's the Queen of England, that is the epitome of a state visit. And so much time goes into selecting the foods that'll be served and selecting the entertainment and the wines. These state dinners have evolved to be kind of showcases of what we are proud of in America, what we want to show our guests. But I found, particularly with the state visits, I looked with presidents and I thought, if you want to find what is the best wine in America at that time, look at what the president served to the Queen of England when the Queen of England came. And I found when during the Bush presidency in 1991, Queen Elizabeth came. So I immediately looked to see what wine they were served, and there was incredible detail put into putting the menu together, the guest list, the entertainment, the flowers, every aspect of it, and the wines. And it was a wine called Shaffer Hillside Select Cabernet, made in California, one of the very best wines you could get at that time. And it was just clear that the Bushes had put a lot of effort into it. And I know from not just their years in the White House, but at the vice president's residence, frequently a visitor who's coming to see the president will also be the day before, day after the vice president's residence, so that the Bushes particularly refined their skills. And the other experience he brought was being so experienced in diplomacy was the art of the toast. Toasts have become fundamental, and I learned a lot, which I can share with you. Some stuff I never expected to learn and didn't want to learn about toast, kind of the origins of them. But in the modern day toast, President Bush was the master. He'd been in so many diplomatic posts, and he knew the nuance and he knew the importance of the messaging that a toast could provide. Sometimes more than a lengthy speech. What's said in that brief 2 or 3 minute period where everyone is focused and they're raising their glasses to each other can be a very powerful tool of diplomacy, and President Bush did it very well.
Oh, that's great, Fred, and that's a great way to think about President Bush sort of leveraging his skills and experiences in diplomacy through wine, through food at these state dinners. And you talked some about how these choices were made. I know that at one of the first official dinners at the White House, a sparkling wine from Washington State was served, where your boss, President Reagan, had often focused on California sparkling wines. Was that an intentional decision that you think President Bush made? How did presidents decide where to bring their wines from? And what was the departure from maybe Reagan to Bush in terms of wine selections?
Sure. Well, if you go all the way back, to answer that question, if you go all the way back, there's been this incredible evolution in the wines that have been served by our presidents at the White House. And in doing this book, I found information going all the way back to George Washington, who obviously we know didn't live in the White House, but I found records of Madeira wine being delivered to him when he was a general during the Revolutionary War, where he and his war council would pause to have a glass of wine as they planned the next moves. And then as you look at presidents moving into the White House, and Madeira, by the way, for those who don't know, it's a wine that's made in an island off the coast of Africa. And the reason it was so popular in America, it was a very hardy wine. It could be, barrels of it could be put in the hull of a ship and transported across the Atlantic Ocean. And the heat, the rough seas, they wouldn't hurt it. In fact, many people felt that it actually made the wine better. So that was kind of the wine of choice for George Washington and John Adams. And then Thomas Jefferson, as you know, he was the ambassador, he was our emissary in Paris. And he was probably more than any president, he shaped the type of wines that were served at the White House. While he was in France, he traveled throughout France, through Germany, through Italy, to all the wine regions. He took copious notes, incredible detail of different wines, different vintages that he enjoyed. He established relationships with the winemakers. And then when he came back to the United States, he advised presidents on what their wine choices would be, in addition to personally selecting all the wines that were served in his White House. And I found a little number that if you looked at today's dollars, Thomas Jefferson served about $70,000 worth of wine every year while he was in the White House, which was quite a bit that time. But I found also, just on Jefferson, I found this letter. I was talking to this guy when I was doing this book, and he said, I have a letter from Thomas Jefferson on my desk. This was a guy who was a winemaker over in France. And I said, well, that's interesting. What does the letter say? And he gave me a copy of it. It was a letter that Thomas Jefferson had written to this winery. The winery is called Chateau Yquem, one of the most famous wineries in the world. It's been around for 250 years, makes a very famous dessert wine. So Thomas Jefferson writes to the proprietor and he says, our new president, General Washington, is interested in wine, and I think he would like your wine. So please send him 30 dozen bottles. And while you're at it, send me 10 dozen bottles too. So that was kind of the pipeline for wine. But to kind of put your question in context, it was French wines that were served almost exclusively. Jefferson kept detailed records of all the wines he served in the White House. And I managed to get a copy of his handwritten notes, and that's in the book that details event by event what he served. And it was French wines until really the 20th century. And a couple of things kind of changed that. One, as you know, Prohibition took place in 20th century, and that's when there were no French wines were imported, and the American wine industry was basically shut down. But when wines came back, starting first, wine wasn't even served. That we were kind of a cocktail nation after World War II because there were no wines. But when they began to be served, they started moving more and more towards American wines. Ronald Reagan, being from California, as you pointed out, was a big proponent. He'd been governor when the California wine industry was coming of age. So he brought California wines to the White House and almost exclusively served them. And when President Bush came in, what he did, which was terrific, he had a wine advisor, one who actually Ronald Reagan had used, a guy out in California in the wine region named David Berkeley. But he sent the word out that he wanted to serve a more varied list of American wines. So instead of just California, there were the one that you mentioned, the sparkling wine from Washington State was served. And that was kind of the beginning of presidents serving more than just California. Now the dominant ones are California, Oregon, Washington, but every state makes wine. And most presidents have served the wine, recent presidents, from their own home state. We'll have to see with President Biden like other presidents, he could serve wines from his home state, except unfortunately, Delaware has the fewest wineries of any state, and it's not ranked very high on the list.
Well, I guess with the vice president being from California, they can look west as well.
Right. Right.
So one thing you mentioned in your book, which I can't say I was familiar with, but it seems like a great week. President Bush signed into law the Wine Appreciation Week, which actually happened after his presidency, but he's the one that made it happen. Is there a story behind that? Was that the wine lobby in America doing a good job of bringing attention to all the good vintages that could be found?
Well, the wine industry in the U.S. Really in the 60s just took root in the 70s and continued to grow. It was a couple of things happened. There was an event that I think many people on the Zoom may have either read the book or seen the movie called Bottle Shock. It was the Judgment of Paris, where American wines were compared blindly against French wines. I actually interviewed the author, Stephen Spurrier, who organized this for this book. And it was a blind tasting where the top winemakers in France and top restaurant maitre d's and the kind of the elite of the French wine world had a tasting. They were invited to taste California wines. And at the last minute, Stephen Spurrier decided to make it a blind tasting and to also insert the best French wines in the tasting. So in this tasting, the movie was historically accurate. The American wines won. So there was, in 1976, there was this huge arrival of American wines. And as you mentioned with President Reagan in the White House, that moved it forward. But President Bush recognized what an enormous industry it was when he declared American Wine Appreciation Week. The American wine industry was a $8 billion industry and employed more than 200,000 people. So it was moving an important aspect of American commerce. It was also something that the government made over $1 billion in tax and tariffs on. So there was that positive side. And I included the proclamation in the book. It goes all the way back, referencing our earliest presidents, including Thomas Jefferson, and the role that they played in advancing wine in America. So it was really very, very well received by the wine industry. It was a great thing for him to do.
So I know that, like many presidents, President and Mrs. Bush had a number of opportunities to host state dinners. And your book does an amazing job of going into a number of these state dinners as examples. You have copies of the menus in there. And then, as was mentioned earlier, in the back, you have an exhaustive list of all of these. And, maybe one thing that we should challenge ourselves to do is kind of go through and try to recreate over time the wine selections from different dinners. It might take a couple years, Fred, but I think you and I are up to the challenge. I wanted
if
to...
we really devote ourselves to it, we might be able to do it, Max.
Thank you. That's we can train for it. But one thing I wanted to ask you about, when you think about some of these dinners, you already mentioned Queen Elizabeth II was hosted by the Bushes, the Queen of Denmark was hosted, President Gorbachev. Can you share with our group any sort of anecdotes from those dinners or things that you may have come across in your research that happened? They didn't have to necessarily be related to the wine, but I know one of the fun things about these state dinners is you get members of Congress and foreign dignitaries, but you also get celebrities and athletes. Did you come across anything interesting from the Bush's 4 years?
I heard a great story. It sounds like it's just so representative of Barbara Bush. There was a state dinner that she and President Bush were hosting at the White House, and she invited her son Marvin to attend the dinner. And when it came to seating for the dinner, she seated him next to Melanie Griffith, who you may remember back in the 1990s was one of the most popular actresses on the planet. And here's Marvin seated next to her. And just as the dinner began, the waiter came over and handed Marvin a note in Mrs. Bush's writing, and he opened it and it said, "Keep your eyes on the food." It was classic Barbara Bush, but they were extremely gracious. If you look at the list of the wines that were served, when the Israeli Prime Minister Shamir came for a state visit, the Bushes made sure that kosher wines were on the menu, out of respect for him. When the Italian Prime Minister came, they served wines that were made by American winemakers of Italian descent, Robert Mondavi, Louis Martini, and they found ways to pay tribute to their host and to find some commonality in the evening, but at the same time showcase the best of American wines. And I came across an amazing story about an Italian-American winemaker, Max, maybe I could share. It's the Johnson administration. The very first state dinner that LBJ had was for the Prime Minister of Italy. And it was scheduled when President Kennedy was alive. And then when President Johnson took over, it was his first state dinner. And he invited Robert Mondavi, who this is, I think 1964, who was just very, very early in his career, but he wanted to have an American of Italian descent who was in the wine business. So he invited Robert Mondavi, and Mondavi talked to his people in Washington who he knew and they said, okay, if you're going to the White House, you need to know something. You need to rent a tuxedo. You got to be there in black tie. Your wife needs to have a full-length mink coat. So you have to have a mink coat for her, and don't come in a taxi. You have to come in a limousine or you'll be embarrassed. So he followed all these instructions. He went to the state dinner, and these photos were taken of Robert Mondavi and his wife getting out of the limousine, full-length mink coat. He's got his tux on. They're talking to all these powerful people. Anyway, those photos made their way back to California, and they ran in the San Francisco Chronicle, the newspaper that served Napa Valley. And Mondavi's brother, Peter, who he was in business with, saw these photos and became convinced that Mondavi must have been embezzling money from the business. And the two of them literally got into a fist fight on the floor. Finally, fight broke up. They ended the business. Robert Mondavi went out and said, I'm just going to start my own then. Started Robert Mondavi Winery, which has probably been the most successful winery in American history. And that all occurred because of this state visit at the White House and those images coming back that his brother saw.
I think that's a good lesson for us about limousines and mink coats and making sure you know when to wear them and not. So Fred, you were talking earlier about Madeira and President Washington and sort of the evolution of wine and wine drinking. We've talked about how, for a long time it was just European wines that were served in the White House, and then President Reagan sort of brought in the California wines, and then President Bush did more to bring in other American wines, which is great. And I think we've seen that in recent years of presidents trying to bring more wines from their home state and elsewhere. But when you think about the history of wine in the White House, I think one era that would be really interesting for you to talk about, that I've thought about when looking at your book, is the Prohibition era. So what did that mean for state dinners? What did that mean for wine drinking and consumption in the White House during the 20s?
It really put a limit on things. And actually, Max, even before Prohibition, in the late 19th century, there was the temperance movement, which was, it became very political. It was a number of women's groups led this, and in political campaigns, they would ask candidates to take the temperance pledge. And one president that really stood out, Rutherford B. Hayes, he was a strong supporter of the temperance movement, and his wife, Lucy Hayes, was one of the leaders of the temperance movement. And here they are, President and First Lady, and there was a very important state dinner coming up. It was the son of the Russian Tsar, who at the time, that was a very important relationship to the United States. And the diplomat said, you must serve wine at this dinner. It will be a diplomatic faux pas. It will be a humiliating gesture to our guest if you don't serve wine. So they relented and said, okay, we're going to serve wine at this one occasion. And they served wine at the dinner. And after that, wine was never served again during the administration of Rutherford B. Hayes. And as I mentioned earlier, there was all this incredible glassware that presidents had purchased with a presidential seal and engraved, really amazing stuff. And Mrs. Hayes used that, but she would only serve fruit juice for the rest of their administration. And she was given the name Lemonade Lucy because she was making people drink fruit juice out of these great presidential glasses. But to your question about Prohibition, so fast forward then the 20th century, Prohibition passes 1920 to 1933, and Woodrow Wilson was president at the time. And when Prohibition was passed, the Volstead Act was passed by Congress to implement it, and Woodrow Wilson actually vetoed the Volstead Act, and Congress overrode his veto and sent it back. So he had a problem. Wine could not be bought, sold, or transported anywhere in the United States. And actually, he was on a visit over to France for an important diplomatic ceremony. And the French prime minister pulled him aside and said, look, no one's looking. Why don't you have this glass of wine, because you can't drink it when you're at home. Gave him some French wine. But he ran into a problem when he was leaving the White House in 1921. He had his own wine cellar there. And technically, it was against the law for him to transport his own wine. So he had to get special regulatory approval for him to move his wine out of the White House over to S Street, to the house that he moved into as a former president. But that continued to 1933, and then Prohibition ended. FDR was president, and he signed the legislation ending Prohibition. And his staff probably has quoted him as saying probably the most appropriate thing after he signed the legislation. He said, "Now would be a good time for a beer." And so Prohibition ended. But as I was mentioning earlier, there was no wine. We were essentially a nation of cocktails. That was what people were drinking, because there was most of the American wineries shut down during Prohibition. And then there was no wine imported during the war. So cocktails became the dominant form of alcohol that was consumed. But then in the late 60s, late 50s and early 60s, the American wine, or wine in general, began to come back. And it was kind of part of pop culture. And I found a really interesting parallel where life imitates art, and pop culture was driving the wine consumption. That President Kennedy, who was a fan of the Ian Fleming novels and the James Bond movies, he was quite a fan, and he saw in May of 1962 the first James Bond movie, Dr. No, came out, and there was a scene in there that the Bond aficionados on the Zoom might remember, where Sean Connery's James Bond grabs a bottle of champagne, he picks it up, and he's about to hit some guards with it. And Dr. No very calmly says, "That's a Dom Perignon 1955. It would be a pity to break it." James Bond puts it back down. Okay, that movie came out in May of 1962. In June of 1962, I got the White House wine list, and when it came to the champagne that was served, it was the Dom Perignon 1955, same one that President Kennedy had seen in the movie.
That's awesome. Well, I'm gonna have to go back and watch that movie again. It's been a while, but that's a great anecdote there. So Fred, you mentioned when Wilson was leaving the White House, there was an issue with the wine from his cellar that he wanted to take with him. Is there a cellar at the White House? What did you learn about over time about the size of the cellar? Is there a history to that? Like, I'm envisioning sort of scenes from a National Treasure movie where you go back into some hidden cave or passageway and find this incredible store of wine that people haven't seen in decades. Is such a thing there? Does it exist? And could you tell us even if it did?
Well, the history of the White House wine cellar is interesting to start off with. It is, the first president to occupy the White House was John Adams, and he moved in late in his term, and then Thomas Jefferson came in, third president. And the White House was still kind of what we would describe today like a punch list situation, where there was still work needing to be done. And Thomas Jefferson says, "Okay, where's the wine cellar?" They say there is no wine cellar. So he designs a wine cellar. And the very first wine cellar in the White House was underneath the North Portico, the part of the White House that you see from Pennsylvania Avenue. And it's actually, by the way, at Monticello, Jefferson's home. He had an exact replica. So if you want to see what the first White House wine cellar looked like, if you're Monticello, look at that cellar, and that is a replica of the White House wine cellar. But he builds a cellar, and then next president, the War of 1812, and President Madison, and in 1814, August of 1814, the British burned the White House, and we all in school learned about Dolly Madison saying, "Save that portrait of George Washington," and they took the portrait out and they saved it with the White House burned. Well, I was interested in, okay, what happened to the White House wine cellar? What happened to it? And what turned out that the British came, they lit the White House on fire, and after it was in flames, they left and they went to burn more of Washington. I think they went to burn the Capitol. So then the American side shows up at the White House, and the White House is essentially burned to the ground, but they see this wine cellar there and the wine's in it. So the American soldiers go open the wine and drink the wine. So the British burned the White House and the American soldiers drank the wine that was there. But the White House wine cellar, it was rebuilt a couple of times, and all the way up to the last major renovation of the White House under President Truman, 1948 to 52. As you know, the entire White House interior was removed and replaced. And the outside remained, but you walk through the White House today. I mean, you're really not walking on steps where Abraham Lincoln walked. You're walking on a 1952 American design, but the White House wine cellar was somehow minimized. So when I worked there, as you mentioned, I worked in the Reagan White House. I wanted to see the White House wine cellar. I had exactly the visions you had of national treasure, and that you'd go in this arched room with, maybe you find a bottle of Thomas Jefferson's wine over in the corner or something. So I kept bugging the White House chief usher, and he finally said, all right, I'll show it to you. And now, the Queen of England has 38,000 bottles of wine in her cellar. And the French president has more than 18,000 bottles of wine in her cellar. So I had all these expectations. They took me over, and it was probably the most disappointing day that I worked in the White House. There really is no wine cellar. It's a closet. It's a little pantry off of the kitchen that's got those little wood slats where they can put maybe 200 or 300 bottles of wine if they're all full. And that's it. No wine cellar. But today the practice has evolved where presidents don't buy wine and leave it in the White House for the next president or anything like that. Wines are purchased event by event. So if there's a state dinner coming up, they'll select the wine. They'll go through a very careful process, which is interesting to kind of see how that evolves. Then they'll purchase the wine. They'll leave it in the cellar. Then they'll serve it all, and then they won't purchase any more until the next event, except for a few bottles in case the president has a guest come by or ask for a glass of wine.
Well, I'm sorry to know that there's not some big expansive White House wine cellar, so I'll have to move on from that. But that was a really interesting story about 1814 and the Thomas Jefferson wine cellar. Good to know that we can go to Monticello and see a similar version. And it's also good to know that on that terrible day where we lost the battle, at least the American soldiers got to have a little wine to, drown their sorrows a little bit.
Well, hopefully a future president will decide that the White House needs a wine cellar of the appropriate size and scale, and will build it and will furnish it for the benefit of future presidents.
So I'm sure that because of the huge sales of this book and all the excitement that you're getting, and we had a great turnout for tonight's event. We have folks from all over the country participating. So not surprisingly, if you schedule something at 6 p.m. Eastern time, you're going to get a lot of participation when it involves wine. So really appreciate you being part of this. I know you're probably thinking of, okay, I've published this book, it's out there, and now you've learned more. Are there things now that you've learned or stories that you've come across or additional insights that you wish you could have included in the book, or that you might include in a second volume at some point?
Well, one thing that I was informed by the White House Historical Association after I did the book was, now, there'll be a new president every 4 or 8 years, so you have to update it and revise it to reflect the new president. And I will. And at this point, the Bidens have not been able to do, because of the pandemic, any large-scale state visits or state entertaining, but I'm sure they will. And when they do, we'll more fully update the book. But I've learned a lot. I've had people send me more information to include in the book, more kind of stories about things that should be done. One thing I've had people, I mentioned the glassware. And as I said earlier, it was in the early days of the United States, and I included a whole chapter on the glassware because it's something that a lot of people, it fascinates you when you see it. And it's in this White House collection. And there are pieces that Abraham Lincoln ordered, and that the cover of the book has a decanter that Madison used at the White House. But one thing I learned was, we buy China. The White House Historical Association actually buys China during usually the second term of a president. So there is plenty of China at the White House. The collection has grown quite a bit. But if you go to the White House right now, if you go to even the most elegant state dinner, the glasses that you will drink from are from a caterer, because the last time someone ordered glassware for the White House to serve their guests was during the Kennedy administration. So maybe that's something that I've learned more about that since the book came out, to answer your question, but maybe that's something that a future president, he or she will decide that should be added to the collection.
Well, and you've talked about how Americans' taste for different types of alcohol ebbs and flows, and there are periods of time where, spirits were more popular than wine. And so maybe there's an addendum one day where you look at, liquors consumed in the White House. I know President Bush loved vodka, so that may be something you consider for an addendum or appendix one of these days.
Maybe we could do it together, Max.
Okay, deal. So, Fred, we're so thankful to have you on this Zoom today and to be able to share these stories and anecdotes with so many of our friends and supporters from across the country. And I mentioned earlier, you do have a pretty unique and absurd resume. And I think one of the things that I'd love to spend a few minutes with you on is just talking about your experiences with President Bush, with President Reagan, your time in the White House. And I think one thing, as I mentioned earlier, that's really interesting, you were working on Governor Reagan's campaign. And when Governor Reagan became the presidential nominee, and when Ambassador Bush became the vice presidential nominee, you were assigned to travel with Ambassador Bush for the fall of 1980. So I think that our audience would love to maybe hear a little bit about that experience of how you really got to know Ambassador Bush during that period of the fall of 1980. And if you have any fun stories or anecdotes to share with us, that would be great.
Well, it was great fun. I was 25 years old and just right out of law school and had the job you dream of at that age, to be able to travel around. And I did do in 1980 as part of the Reagan Bush campaign. I did do a number of the trips with then Ambassador Bush, and it was terrific. I mean, that's when I learned that he, like so many people I know on this Zoom who were very close to him and many who worked for him, know that he's one of those rare people who was exactly the same on camera as he was behind closed doors. So many political figures we meet have got this lovely public persona, and then behind closed doors they can be so difficult and pound the table. And he was just a genuine person all the way around. But I had an experience, and I shared this with you, Max, and you've assured me that the statute of limitations is passed and I won't get any trouble in sharing this. But what happened on election day in 1980, on the final event of the campaign, took place in Peoria, Illinois. And the idea was, this has got to play in Peoria, the old saying. And at that event was former President Ford, former Governor Ronald Reagan, Ambassador Bush, and Bob Hope. It was like the big finale. And I was there assigned to work on the event for Ambassador Bush. And that was election day. So that after that event, everyone flew back to their election party headquarters. Ronald Reagan flew to Los Angeles, the Century Plaza Hotel for Victory Night, and President Bush flew to Houston for Victory Night there. And I had to stay. I was an advanced person. I left, and they said, "Okay, you go to Houston. You'll never make it to LA. You go to Houston, and you've done the last few events with Ambassador Bush anyway." So I fly to Houston. I get there. There's no hotel rooms. They said this whole place is booked. Sorry. And I didn't have a place to stay. So as you may remember, the results came in very early in 1980. The polls closed and the Reagan-Bush ticket won very, very early. And as a result, President Bush, or Vice President-elect Bush at the time, he was staying at the presidential suite in the hotel. And he had a house in Houston. So he decided to just go stay in his house. The party was over so soon. So I arrived and they told me there's no hotel, there's no room, I'm sorry. And they got there and they said last minute, "You're lucky, we have a hotel room for you." I said, "Oh, that's great." They said, "It's a presidential suite." I said, "That's even better." So like everybody, I went down, celebrated the whole night, the big victory, went upstairs, went in the room, went to sleep. And then the phone started ringing and I pick up the phone and it's the president of Egypt calling to send best wishes to Vice President-elect Bush. And I said, "Oh, thank you. I will take a note and I'll pass this on." And then the next call comes in, Prime Minister of Japan calling. "I want to pass on my congratulations to George Bush." And I will pass that on. These calls kept coming in. So finally I thought, this is just getting too hard to write this down. So next call came in and they said it was the Prime Minister of France calling on to pass his congratulations. And I just said, "Well, I'll just take out the middleman." And they said, "Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your calling me. That means a lot." And I get off. The next call comes in, and it's another, had been putting the head of state through, Prime Minister of Australia. "Yes, calling to say congratulations. Do you think you could have a state visit?" I said, Yeah, I'll have my people get back to you on that." So it had a little bit of fun. And the reason I asked is I hope that 40 years later that somebody paid for that hotel room. And secondly, that the statute of limitations on impersonating a vice president-elect has passed.
Well, it sounds like you did some unintentional diplomacy, and I'm sure it worked out well for the Reagan-Bush administration. But I can certainly appreciate how tired you were, and at a certain point, it got easier to just play along. So I think a lot has been written, and a lot of historians have talked about that relationship between President Reagan and President Bush. And they had been, rivals for the nomination multiple times. And there was sort of all of the back channeling and conversations that were taking place in Detroit, trying to figure out who the nominee was going to be. And there was this idea about bringing Ford back, and Secretary Kissinger was involved, and all of this sort of backroom dealing. But of course, in the end, Governor Reagan picked Ambassador Bush. And one extraordinary thing he did that you would know very well is, Secretary Baker became President Reagan's chief of staff, which was an extraordinary move by President Reagan to bring in President Bush's best friend and campaign manager to do that. But I think there's probably very few people who understood that Reagan-Bush dynamic as well as you do. Could you talk a little bit about that relationship? Because a lot of people think they understand it, but what did you see when you served in the Reagan White House, and then maybe even after when President Reagan had returned to California, that relationship between these two men?
Well, I think they formed a very close relationship right from the start. And I know President Reagan had a saying. He said he wanted his vice president to be a part of everything they did, and didn't think the role of the vice president should just be to come in and take the president's pulse and make sure they're still alive. So he did involve President Bush in every meeting. President Bush had carte blanche, or vice president at the time had carte blanche to attend any meeting at any time. Played a very consequential role in the administration. I think the two of them became very close. They had a tradition Thursday afternoons of having Tex-Mex, both of them living in states where Mexican food was popular. The two of them would get together. And that was a tradition that would not be broken. That was scheduled no matter what, just the two of them getting a chance to catch up. And when Vice President Bush ran for president, of course, President Reagan traveled around actively campaigning for him. And then when he was president, when he was out west, he would make a point of coming by to see Ronald Reagan. And he didn't have to do that, but he came out constantly to see President Reagan in his office when there was a major event taking place, a summit, say, President Bush would call former President Reagan, just kind of talking through his experience on it. So they had a very, very close bond, a great bond of trust and enormous mutual respect. I think it was just the best example of a president and vice president working together, and then a current president being so deferential and respectful to the former president.
So I don't want to talk politics tonight because we're trying to keep it light, and this is a great opportunity for us to have some fun with White House history and wine. But I think about your career, and I think about the time you spent in the White House and the time you spent working for President Reagan and chairing the White House Historical Association and also the Reagan Foundation for so many years. There's the Reagan Institute now in Washington, which is doing a great job. But of course, you spent a lot of time in media as well, and you're at the Washington Post now. Just from your perspective, what is it like to be somebody who has straddled those sort of different sides of the coin, if you will? And what is it like now to be at an organization that is covering the White House? These have not been boring times for media, but how do you reflect upon your career, and what are some sort of takeaways you have from being on sort of both sides of this?
Well, one thing I learned both from being on the media side and in the White House, that no White House is happy with the media coverage they get. It's human nature, right? I mean, you're doing certain things that are your priorities and they deserve attention, and then you have the media out there pointing out the things you fail on and not just the things you succeed with. So there's always, and I think it's, I mean, I won't get political about it, but I think there's always been a healthy tension between presidents and the media that covers them. I think it's just good for democracy to have this healthy tension, but I don't think it should get personal. And recently it just seems to have gone that direction. But the one thing I've noticed just from how the world has changed, when I worked in the White House, I mean, there was no internet, there were no computers. We got faxes late in the Reagan administration, and the cell phones we have were like the size of literally a brick, and they would work for 20 minutes, and we only got those at the very end of the administration. But the way the news cycle worked back then, there was a news cycle, right? I mean, the president would say something, and then the Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, or the opposition party would respond, and then the news cycle would develop. The next day, you'd pick up the Washington Post, and you'd see the the point and the response and a critique, maybe some analysis. Today, that's totally changed. I mean, with the internet, the speed at which things move, there is no news cycle. I mean, I kind of use the term, it's a news cyclone. Things are just constantly spinning. The pre-buttal comes out before the statement's made. And the speed at which things move now, I mean, and we should all be concerned, and this isn't just in the political context, in broader context, false statements, it's documented, move faster and more broadly on the internet than true statements do. And there's, we're in this essentially this misinformation or disinformation age where so many false things are out there. And it makes it very difficult for people in office because an idea can take root very quickly. And, you know, a tweet takes a second and 1,000 more tweets can take place in another second. And the message is global. So it really positions people in government and in media and in business to be very focused on the speed at which things move and managing the message and being on all these platforms. And I think it's only getting worse. If you look at these deep fakes now, as you know, the kind of fake versions of video, those are becoming very troubling because the technology now is not something that requires a computer genius or somebody hacking in their basement who really knows the world of the internet. It's very simple. Very unsophisticated people can make deep fakes that show people, world leaders, saying things they didn't say. And I know in Africa, there have been cases already where a deep fake will be produced by the leader of one nation or group saying something that's not true, and that will start violence up by his opponent or her, based on what was said that really wasn't even said in the first place. So we're in the media space, we have to be very careful that we don't take the bait or react to things that are just falsely moving around the internet. But office holders have to deal with a very, very quick reaction time. And they have the war rooms and the rapid response teams, and that's just an essential part of being in political office today.
Well, Fred, thank you for that perspective. That's really interesting and invaluable. It does make me want to drink more wine because it's not terribly uplifting, but I'm glad you're working on this, and I'm glad you have that perspective, and I'm sure that your colleagues in journalism also understand these challenges. So I talked earlier about how I've got this Chardonnay from Washington. Well, this one's from Santa Barbara. We were talking about some wines from Washington State, but what are you drinking, Fred? And tell us some of your favorite wines. I don't want you to play favorites because I know if Fred Ryan endorses a wine, that's going to be a big deal. But what are your go-tos?
Well, I don't have the budget you have, Max, for wine, so mine will be on the more affordable list. But I'll tell you, there was a wine I don't have any commercial stake in this. I'm not trying to plug it, but a wine that I just thought, you and I agreed we were going to have wine tonight and have a glass. So I was thinking what wine would be appropriate in kind of tribute to what President Bush stood for. And I learned about this wine it's made in California. This woman grew up in the Soviet Union and she wanted to come to the United States as a young girl. And she kept calling the United States the land of promise. And it was her hope to get out. And this was the time that President Bush was managing the end of the Cold War. And as a young girl, she got out, she came to the United States, she took advantage of our great education system and all the opportunities that America has. And she and her husband decided they wanted to start a winery. So they started very modest. They didn't have much. They bought a pickup truck and a tractor and a little bit of land, and they planted grapes. And they named the wine Land of Promise because here she was, she got into the United States, the place she called the Land of Promise. And it's made out in Napa Valley. I even hold it up because you can see it's got the American flag on the label. And I'm not a spokesman. I don't own any stock or anything, but I just thought it was a great American story and a story that reflects kind of what President Bush stood for.
Wow, that is a great story. And I do love Pinot Noirs, and maybe we'll have to serve that at an upcoming Bush Foundation event. But thank you for sharing that with us. And Fred, I want to thank you too for taking the time this evening. Your book's remarkable, and for those who are watching this tonight, who are with us tonight, who haven't had a chance to read it, I strongly recommend it. It is a coffee table book in terms of its size and weight, as you discussed earlier, but it's not the sort of coffee table book that you can put down. And so I highly recommend it to all of our friends to enjoy it. And this conversation was so wide-ranging. We were able to learn more about President Bush and Mrs. Bush and some great anecdotes from their time in the White House and the role of wine for them, but also for presidents going back to George Washington. So very thankful that you could be with us this evening, Fred.
Well, Max, thank you for the time. And I would just add on this book, I think, I'm out talking about it because 100% of the proceeds go to the White House Historical Association's education efforts. I felt if I did this, I should underwrite the production, and our friend John Rogers, a Bush administration alum, underwritten all of the printing costs. So when somebody buys this book, it goes to educating young people about the institution of the presidency 100%. So I hope that might be an incentive for people who are thinking about it. But thank you for giving me the platform. And Max, it's great to see you. We were directors of the Metropolitan Club together, got a chance to work when you were in Washington. And it's just so great to see the leadership you're providing now at the Bush Foundation.
Well, thank you, Fred. And I think we've got some homework that we talked about earlier about going through your book and trying out all these different wines. And the great thing, too, about tonight's event is that it's going to be available on our website for more people to see after this evening. And so just a reminder to all of our friends, you can find previous virtual events like the one we did with Jim Baker and Brett Baer last spring on the Gulf War, the one we recently did with Ambassador Crocker. We had a great event with Dana Perino a few months back. Those are all available. I also would like to mention a couple of events we have coming up tomorrow, actually, for friends who are in College Station at the Mosbacher Institute at the Bush School. We're jointly hosting an event to give the Drayton McLean Award to Ryan Lance, who is the CEO of ConocoPhillips, and Ryan is a board member of the George and Barbara Bush Foundation. So if anyone is in the area tomorrow and would like to come to that, there's information on our website. I also should mention on October 27th, and we're very excited about this because we haven't been able to have a lot of events in person, but we're going to be having a 30th anniversary Gulf War event here in College Station. And at the same time, we're going to be giving Secretary Baker the George H.W. Bush Award. So we're very much looking forward to that. Again, please go to our site and sign up. And then finally, and I mentioned this earlier, this is the start of sort of our wine season at the Bush Foundation. And so we're having our annual Vintner Dinner on November 18th. And so I don't know if I can get Fred down there for it, but hopefully some other folks who are on this Zoom tonight can participate. So a big thank you, Fred, again, for being part of this. And a big thank you to all of our friends and supporters out there. We're proud for what we do. We think the legacy and values of President and Mrs. Bush are more important than they've ever been, and appreciate everybody for being part of that work. So good night and take care.